The rancher woke up in the chief's sacred tent, and 3 Apache women were watching him. John Miller had always been a man of routine. Every morning, the sun barely peeking over the distant hills, he would saddle his horse, lead the cattle out to pasture, and begin his day with the steady rhythm of ranch life. The world around him was vast and wild, with stretches of golden plains, thick forests, and the occasional sparkling stream that cut through the land like a ribbon of silver. For years, John had lived on this edge of the frontier, familiar with the gentle sway of the grass, the rustling of trees in the wind, and the distant calls of birds that marked the changing seasons. Life was hard but honest, and he took comfort in its predictability. But that morning, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, and the usual sounds of nature were muted, as if the world itself was holding its breath. John dismissed the feeling, attributing it to the lingering cold that clung to the valley after a frost. He saddled his horse, Whisper, and set off on a short ride to check a distant fence line that had been damaged by a recent storm. He had done this ride countless times before and felt confident in the familiar path winding through the hills. As he guided Whisper along the narrow trail, John's thoughts wandered to the simple pleasures of his life. He thought about the warm breakfast he would have once he returned, the letters he had been meaning to send, and the quiet evenings by the fireplace after a long day of work. The world seemed calm, almost too calm. Yet in the back of his mind, a subtle unease nagged at him, a whisper of warning that he chose to ignore. By midday, John reached a part of the trail he rarely visited. The forest thickened here, and the sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy. The familiar sounds of the ranch faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of insects. Whisper hesitated for a moment, ears pricked, sensing something unusual. John patted her neck to calm her, assuring himself that it was just a quiet part of the forest. Without warning, a sudden movement caught his eye. Shadows shifted among the trees, and before he could react, he felt strong hands grip his arms and pull him from the saddle. The world spun, and Whisper whinnied in alarm as he was dragged off the trail. John struggled, but the hands were firm, skilled, and unyielding. Within moments, he realized he was surrounded. A group of Apache scouts had emerged silently, their movements swift and precise, leaving no chance for escape. Fear surged through him, sharp and electric. John's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He had heard stories of travelers encountering Native American tribes, some peaceful, some hostile, but he had never imagined being caught himself. The scouts spoke in a language he did not understand, their faces serious and alert. He could sense no immediate threat to his life, yet the tension in their posture made it clear that he was now under their control. Every instinct told him to fight, but he knew it would be futile. The scouts were skilled and coordinated, and resistance would only make things worse. He was led through winding trails, deeper into the forest, moving at a pace that left no room for hesitation. Hours seemed to pass, though he had no way to measure the time. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that stretched across the land like dark fingers. John's body ached from exhaustion and fear, but his mind remained alert, observing every detail. He noticed the careful way the scouts moved, the subtle signals they exchanged, and the respect they seemed to show each other. There was discipline here, a silent understanding that went beyond words. Eventually, they arrived at a clearing where a small village lay hidden among the trees. The village was unlike anything John had seen, simple yet purposeful, with structures made of wood, earth, and animal hides. Smoke rose from several fires, carrying the scent of cooking and burning sage. The air felt different here, charged with a sense of history and tradition. John's heart pounded as the scouts led him toward a large tent at the center of the village. It was adorned with symbols he could not understand, its entrance guarded with care and respect. Inside the tent, the atmosphere shifted. The smell of smoke and herbs was stronger, and the soft flicker of firelight cast shadows on the walls. John's eyes adjusted, and he realized he was not alone. 3 women stood before him, their expressions calm but watchful. They wore traditional clothing, adorned with beads and patterns that told stories he could only imagine. Their eyes met his, steady and unflinching, as if they were measuring his intentions, trying to understand the man who had stumbled into their world. John felt a wave of vulnerability he had never experienced before. Here he was, a stranger in a place that was not his own, completely dependent on the mercy and understanding of people he did not know. Yet, there was no cruelty in their gaze, only curiosity and caution. It was clear that his fate would depend not on his strength, but on his ability to respect their customs and prove his intentions. The chief appeared shortly after, a tall man with a presence that commanded attention without words. He did not speak immediately but observed John with quiet intensity. Through gestures and careful movements, he began to communicate the situation. John realized that he was in a state of observation, not punishment. The chief and his people wanted to understand who he was, why he was here, and whether he could be trusted. The weight of the moment pressed on John's shoulders, but he felt a strange sense of relief. At least he was alive, and the situation, while tense, was not immediately dangerous. As the hours passed, John began to notice the details of the women around him. One moved gracefully, tending to the fire and preparing food with practiced hands. Another observed him keenly, her eyes flicking between his gestures and expressions, as if trying to decipher his thoughts. The third maintained a quiet presence, sitting near the edge of the tent, her gaze steady and thoughtful. Each movement, each glance, seemed purposeful, a language of observation and understanding that John had to learn quickly if he wanted to survive and earn their trust. John attempted to communicate using gestures and simple words. At first, the women watched silently, responding only with subtle nods or shifts in posture. It was a slow process, requiring patience and humility. He realized that any attempt to rush or force understanding would only create mistrust. Instead, he observed them, mimicking small actions, showing respect for their space and routines. Gradually, he began to sense a rhythm, a silent dialogue forming between him and the women. By the end of the day, John felt a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and wonder. The initial fear that had gripped him was still present, but it was tempered by a growing awareness of the intelligence, discipline, and care of the people around him. He had entered this world as an outsider, disoriented and frightened, yet he had begun the first steps toward understanding, observing, learning, and respecting the people who had become his unexpected hosts. As night fell, the tent glowed with the soft light of the fire, casting shadows that danced across the walls. The 3 women continued their quiet vigilance, their presence a constant reminder that John was no longer in familiar territory. He lay on a simple mat, exhausted but alert, contemplating the day's events. He knew that tomorrow would bring more challenges, more lessons, and more opportunities to prove himself. But for now, he closed his eyes, letting the sounds of the fire and the distant calls of the forest lull him into a restless sleep, aware that his life had changed forever the moment he had awakened in the chief's sacred tent. The next morning, John awoke to the soft rustle of leaves outside the tent and the faint smell of smoke curling in from nearby fires. His body ached from the previous day's ordeal, but his mind was alert, aware that he was still very much in an unfamiliar world. The 3 women who had watched him so closely the day before were already moving about, performing their morning routines with quiet precision. One tended to the fire, carefully stoking the embers, another swept the floor with practiced movements, and the third gathered fresh water from a small container nearby. Their presence was calm yet purposeful, and John felt a mixture of awe and nervousness as he watched them. He realized that the first step to surviving here was understanding, not just the language, which he did not yet know, but the customs, the gestures, and the small, unspoken rules that governed life in this camp. The women's movements were deliberate, and every glance or nod seemed to carry meaning. John understood that to gain their trust, he would need to observe carefully and mirror their respect and patience. Tentatively, he rose from his simple mat and tried to mimic some of their actions. He began by gently adjusting the firewood, careful not to disturb the pattern they had created. One of the women, Xiana, noticed and paused, her dark eyes studying him intently. John froze for a moment, uncertain whether he had committed a mistake. Then slowly, she nodded ever so slightly, a small sign of acknowledgement, perhaps even approval. Relief washed over him, and he realized that this was progress. Throughout the morning, John paid close attention to every detail of the camp. He noticed how the women communicated silently, using gestures, eye contact, and subtle shifts of posture. It was a form of language he had never encountered before, one that relied on observation and intuition rather than words. At first, he felt clumsy and awkward, but gradually he began to understand some of the patterns. When one woman pointed toward an object and then back at him, she seemed to be asking him to use it or help in some way. When another shook her head or raised an eyebrow, it signaled caution. The chief arrived mid-morning, moving with a calm authority that immediately commanded attention. He did not speak at first, only observing John and the women with a steady gaze. Then, through a series of gestures, he began to explain John's position. The rancher understood that he was not a prisoner in the strictest sense, but rather someone under careful observation. His behavior, his respect for their customs, and his willingness to learn would determine how he was treated. John spent the day cautiously engaging in small tasks. He helped carry water from a nearby stream, learning the proper way to balance the heavy containers. He assisted in preparing simple food, observing how the women handled each step with care and efficiency. They worked without hurry, yet everything they did had a clear purpose. John marveled at their skill and discipline, realizing that every action in the camp was part of a larger rhythm, a rhythm that he would need to understand if he wanted to be accepted. As the hours passed, John found himself becoming more comfortable with their presence. The initial fear he had felt when waking in the tent had not entirely disappeared, but it had softened into a cautious curiosity. He began to appreciate the quiet intelligence and strength of the three women, noticing the way they moved through their tasks with confidence and care. One of them, Naeli, allowed him to assist in weaving a simple mat, guiding his hands with patience. Though the task was unfamiliar, he followed her instructions, careful not to ruin her work. A small smile flickered across her face when he managed it correctly, and he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. By mid-afternoon, John had begun to notice patterns in their routines. The women gathered food from the surrounding area, carefully selecting plants and herbs with knowledge that spoke of generations of learning. They prepared meals with skill and efficiency, ensuring that everyone in the camp had enough to eat. John watched them not just to learn tasks, but to understand the values behind their actions, respect for the land, for their people, and for the life they nurtured. Communication remained a challenge. John could not understand their language, and they could not understand his. Yet through patience, gestures, and observation, a fragile understanding began to form. Simple exchanges, passing a tool, pointing to an object, or mimicking an action, became the foundation of this new, unspoken dialogue. John realized that words were not the only way to communicate. Actions, respect, and attentiveness could convey meaning just as powerfully. As evening approached, John sat quietly by the fire, watching the women finish their tasks. The camp had a rhythm that was both calming and intense. Fires were tended, meals were shared, and the children of the village moved about under the watchful eyes of the women and elders. John felt a growing sense of connection, despite the barriers of language and culture. The initial fear that had gripped him the day before was now replaced by a sense of belonging, fragile, uncertain, but real. The three women gathered near him, observing his every move. One, Ayana, seemed to study his reactions, noting how he responded to instructions and gestures. Another, Naeli, moved closer, offering small hints and guidance. The third remained a quiet presence, her gaze steady and assessing. John realized that their watchfulness was not meant to intimidate but to teach, to guide him toward understanding their world. Night fell, and the firelight flickered against the walls of the tent. John lay on his mat, reflecting on the day's experiences. He thought about the trust he was beginning to build, the lessons he had learned through observation, and the challenges that lay ahead. The chief's presence remained a silent reminder that he was still under scrutiny, but it was also a sign of potential acceptance if he continued to show respect and humility. In the quiet moments before sleep, John allowed himself to feel gratitude. Though he had been captured and placed in an unfamiliar world, he had been treated with a level of dignity and caution that was rare for someone in his position. The three women, once mysterious figures who had seemed distant and watchful, were now teachers, guides, and observers who had begun to show him the ways of their world. John understood that this was only the beginning. He would need to continue learning, observing, and respecting the customs of the tribe. The skills he had gained on his ranch, patience, hard work, and resourcefulness, would serve him well, but he would also need to embrace new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing the world. The day had taught him that survival was not just about physical strength, but about understanding, respect, and the ability to connect across differences. As he drifted into sleep, the sounds of the camp, the crackling fire, the rustling of leaves, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals surrounded him. The women remained vigilant, their watchful presence a reminder of the lessons yet to come. John knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to learn, and new chances to prove himself. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of peace, aware that he was no longer just a rancher from the frontier, but a guest in a world rich with tradition, wisdom, and humanity. As the days passed, John began to feel a sense of rhythm in the camp. What had once seemed mysterious and intimidating was slowly becoming familiar. He observed the women moving through their daily routines with a grace and precision that left him in awe. Every movement had meaning, every gesture conveyed information, and every action reflected the deep knowledge and experience they had gained over a lifetime. It was a world of structure and discipline, one that required patience and attentiveness, qualities John had learned to cultivate on his ranch, but which now took on a new significance. The three women had started to acknowledge his presence more openly, though always cautiously. Yana, the most observant of the three, often guided him silently, showing him how to perform small tasks without words. She taught him how to gather firewood efficiently, how to carry water without spilling a drop, and how to tend the simple cooking fires that sustained the camp. Every time he completed a task correctly, she would give him a small nod or a fleeting smile, gestures that were subtle but deeply meaningful in this world. Naeli, on the other hand, was more interactive. She encouraged him to try new things, sometimes allowing him to help weave mats or prepare simple meals. Her patience was remarkable, and she never expressed frustration when John made mistakes. Instead, she would place his hands on the materials, guiding him carefully, and repeat the motions until he began to understand. John realized that learning here was not about speed or perfection, but about attention, respect, and willingness to follow the guidance offered. The third woman remained quiet, observing both John and the others, yet her presence was no less important. She seemed to act as a silent judge, weighing his actions and decisions, testing his intentions without uttering a word. John found her gaze unsettling at first, But over time, he came to understand that her quiet vigilance was a form of teaching. She was teaching him the value of thoughtfulness, awareness, and humility, qualities that could not be rushed or forced. John's days were now filled with small lessons and subtle challenges. He began to notice the unspoken rules of the camp: when to speak, when to remain silent, when to act, and when to observe. It was a careful balance, one that required constant attention. Mistakes were not met with anger, but with subtle corrections, guiding him toward the understanding that respect and patience were the foundations of trust. One morning, Yana led him to the edge of the camp where the forest began to thin, revealing open fields and a small creek. Here, she began teaching him about tracking. John had some experience on his ranch, but the methods were different. The ground here held subtle signs, footprints, broken twigs, bent grass, all telling a story to those who could read them. Yana showed him how to follow a trail without disturbing it, how to move silently through the brush, and how to anticipate the movement of animals. John struggled at first, his movements clumsy and hesitant, but she guided him patiently, correcting his posture and steps until he began to move with more confidence. Back at the camp, Naomi continued teaching him about the spiritual customs of the tribe, though in a subtle and careful way. She explained, through gestures and simple demonstrations, the importance of respecting nature, the role of rituals in daily life, and the meaning behind certain symbols he had seen on the walls of the tents. John realized that every action in the camp, no matter how small, had a purpose and a connection to a larger tradition. This understanding deepened his respect for the people around him and their way of life. John began to feel a sense of accomplishment. Small successes, like carrying water without spilling or weaving a simple mat correctly, brought him confidence. But more importantly, he started to understand the unspoken lessons: patience, respect, observation, and the importance of community. Each day was a test, not of strength or intelligence, but of character. The three women were his teachers, guiding him gently yet firmly toward becoming someone who could be trusted. The camp itself seemed to respond to his growing understanding. The children would sometimes approach him cautiously, testing his reactions, while the elders watched silently, noting his progress. The chief, though rarely speaking directly to him, observed John's efforts with approval. John realized that trust in this world was earned slowly, through consistent behavior and genuine respect, rather than demanded or assumed. One afternoon, the camp faced a small crisis. A fire had started near the edge of the forest, likely from a spark carried by the wind. The women sprang into action immediately, organizing the villagers to prevent it from spreading. John followed their lead, helping where he could. He carried water, cleared dry brush, and assisted in directing the children to safety. Though his movements were still slower and less practiced than the others, his willingness to act and his attention to the instructions given to him were noted. The fire was contained quickly, and John felt a deep sense of relief and pride. He had contributed, even in a small way, to the safety of the camp. After the fire, the chief acknowledged John's efforts through a series of gestures, indicating that his actions had been observed and appreciated. The women's expressions, too, reflected quiet approval. John understood that this was an important moment. He had moved from being merely a guest under observation to someone who could be trusted to participate in the life of the camp. As evening fell, John sat by the fire, reflecting on all he had learned. He thought about the lessons from the day, the importance of patience, the value of observation, and the necessity of respect for the traditions and people around him. He realized that his time in the camp was changing him, not just in skills or knowledge, but in perspective. The world he had known on his ranch, though familiar and comfortable, was narrow compared to the rich, complex life of the village. The three women gathered near him, their presence comforting rather than intimidating. Yana offered a small smile as he helped arrange firewood for the night. Naeli gently guided his hands as he prepared a simple meal, showing him how to season it with herbs gathered from the surrounding forest. The third woman remained near the edge of the firelight, her eyes calm and assessing. John understood that they were no longer just observers, they were partners in his learning, helping him navigate a world that had once seemed foreign and threatening. That night, as John lay on his mat, he felt a quiet satisfaction. He had made mistakes, stumbled in his actions, and felt uncertain at times, but he had learned, adapted, and grown. The trust of the women, the subtle acknowledgement of the chief, and the acceptance of the community were all signs that he was moving forward. He had discovered that survival in this world was not about domination or control, but about understanding, respect, and the willingness to listen and learn. John closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of the camp settling for the night. The women's watchful presence remained a reminder that his journey was far from over. There would be more lessons, more challenges, and more opportunities to prove himself. But for the first time since waking in the chief's sacred tent, he felt a sense of hope and possibility. He was no longer merely a captive or an outsider. He was a student, learning the ways of a people whose wisdom and strength had already begun to leave a lasting impression on him. The stars shone brightly above the camp, reflected in the still waters of the nearby creek. John thought about the vastness of the world and the smallness of his own worries in comparison. He understood that this experience, though unexpected and challenging, was shaping him in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. The three women, once strangers watching him with wary eyes, had become guides and teachers, opening a door to understanding and respect that he had never known before. As sleep overtook him, John felt a quiet determination. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new opportunities to learn, and perhaps new challenges to overcome. But he was ready, armed not with weapons or force, but with patience, humility, and the growing understanding of a world that had once seemed mysterious and intimidating. In the quiet of the night, with the camp around him breathing in a steady rhythm, John felt a sense of belonging he had never imagined, a connection to a people, a culture, and a way of life that would change him forever. Days passed, and John's presence in the camp had become more accepted. He moved through the routines with growing confidence, helped with tasks, and continued learning from the three women who had once watched him cautiously. He had begun to understand the rhythm of the village, the importance of patience, and the deep knowledge embedded in every action the villagers performed. Life had settled into a pattern, a careful balance of observation, learning, and participation. Yet despite this growing sense of familiarity, John could sense that the world outside the village remained unpredictable, dangerous, and full of challenges. One morning, as the sun rose over the distant hills, John noticed a heightened tension in the camp. The chief had gathered several of the men and some women near the edge of the village, their expressions serious and focused. From his vantage point near the fire, John could see their hands pointing toward the horizon, eyes scanning the tree line, and bodies poised as if ready to respond to an unseen threat. He did not yet understand fully what was happening, but he could feel the urgency in the air. The three women were more alert than usual. Jana moved with a sense of purpose, gathering tools and preparing materials, while Naeli carefully watched the children, ensuring they remained safe. The third woman remained calm but vigilant, her eyes following every movement in the camp. John realized that something significant was about to occur, a test not just of his skills, but of his ability to act with respect, courage, and intelligence. Soon it became clear that a group of outsiders, strangers to the village, had approached the area. Their intentions were unknown, but the chief's demeanor and the camp's swift preparation suggested that they could pose a danger. John's heart raced. He had never faced such a situation before, not in his quiet life on the ranch. Yet, he knew that panic would not serve him here. He had been learning to observe, to understand, and to act thoughtfully, and now those lessons would be put to the test. The villagers moved with impressive coordination. Men took positions at key points near the perimeter, while women and children were guided to safer areas. Fires were tended, tools were prepared, and signals were established. John followed instructions carefully, carrying water to put out small sparks and helping to clear brush that could fuel a fire. Though he was slower and less experienced than the villagers, his willingness to assist and his attentiveness were noted. Every action mattered, and John felt the weight of responsibility pressing on him. As the outsiders drew closer, John could see the determination in the villagers' eyes. They were defending not only their home but their traditions, their families, and the land that had nurtured them for generations. The three women continued to guide him quietly. Jana pointed to positions where he could be helpful, Naeli reminded him of tasks to complete, and the third woman's steady gaze reinforced the importance of focus and awareness. John realized that survival here was not about strength alone. It was about cooperation, observation, and trust. The confrontation, though tense, did not erupt into violence. The villagers, careful preparations, and strategic positioning created a clear message. The camp was protected, and any attempt to threaten it would be met with coordinated resistance. John watched as the chief communicated silently with his people, using gestures, signals, and quiet commands. The outsiders hesitated, perhaps sensing the unity and preparedness of the village, and eventually retreated, leaving the camp intact. Relief washed over John, mingled with a sense of awe at the villagers' skill and discipline. After the incident, the chief gathered John and gestured toward the edge of the camp, signaling that he wanted to speak with him privately. John followed cautiously, aware that his actions during the confrontation would be evaluated. The chief's gaze was steady, observing John closely. Through gestures and expressions, he conveyed approval. John had acted respectfully, attentively, and with courage. Though he was still an outsider, he had earned a degree of trust that few newcomers received so quickly. The three women were present, their expressions calm but pleased. Gianna touched John lightly on the shoulder, a subtle sign of acknowledgement for his efforts. Naeli nodded, her eyes reflecting pride and quiet satisfaction. Even the third woman, who had been so reserved, offered a small, approving smile. John felt a deep sense of gratitude and connection. He understood that this moment was more than recognition. It was a turning point. He had moved from being a passive observer to an active participant in the life of the village. As the day continued, John reflected on what had happened. The confrontation had been a test, a challenge to see how he would respond under pressure. He realized that his time in the camp had changed him. He was no longer just a rancher from the frontier. He had become someone capable of observing, learning, and contributing to a community very different from his own. The lessons of patience, respect, and humility had prepared him for this moment, and he could see now how essential they were in the face of real danger. Later that evening, the camp returned to its usual rhythm. Fires were tended, meals were prepared, and the children played safely under the watchful eyes of the women. John joined in, helping where he could, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The chief observed quietly, acknowledging John's efforts without words. The three women continued their gentle guidance, teaching him the value of continued learning, even in moments of calm. As night fell, John sat quietly by the fire, reflecting on the choices he had faced. He had been confronted with a situation that demanded courage and respect, and he had realized that his actions could have real consequences for the people around him. He understood that loyalty and trust were not simply given. They were earned through consistent behavior, attention to detail, and a willingness to put the needs of others alongside his own. John also began to think about his own life beyond the camp. The experience had shown him a different perspective, a broader understanding of the world and the people in it. He realized that the lessons he had learned here about patience, observation, respect, and courage were not limited to the village. They were universal, applicable to all aspects of life, whether on his ranch or in any community he might encounter. The three women gathered near him as the firelight flickered across their faces. Iana offered a small smile, acknowledging his growth and effort. Naeli touched his hand gently, reinforcing the trust that had begun to develop between them. The third woman remained quiet but attentive, her steady gaze a reminder that learning and vigilance were continuous processes. John felt a profound sense of gratitude and connection. He understood that he was no longer merely a visitor in the camp. He had become part of its story, however briefly. In the quiet of the night, John contemplated the future. The confrontation had been a moment of danger, but it had also been a moment of growth. He had seen firsthand the strength, intelligence, and resilience of the villagers. He had learned the importance of trust, cooperation, and humility, and he had realized that his choices mattered, not only for his own survival, but for the well-being of those around him. As he lay on his mat, listening to the soft sounds of the village settling for the night, John felt a sense of determination. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, and new opportunities to prove himself further. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection, aware that he had faced fear, acted with respect and courage, and earned a place in the hearts and minds of people who had once seemed distant and mysterious. John understood that life in the village was a delicate balance of observation, action, and respect. He had been tested, and he had passed in ways that went beyond skill or strength. He had demonstrated character, patience, and an understanding of the deeper rhythms of the community. The three women, once mere observers, had become mentors and guides, helping him navigate a world he had never imagined. The stars shone above the camp, their light reflected in the quiet waters of the nearby creek. John felt a sense of peace, tempered by the awareness that the journey was far from over. There would be more lessons to learn, more challenges to face, and more opportunities to demonstrate his understanding and respect. But he was ready. He had grown stronger, wiser, and more aware, and he knew that he could face whatever came next with courage, patience, and humility. In that moment, John felt a deep connection to the village, to its people, and to the three women who had guided him so patiently. He understood that trust was earned through actions, that courage was measured in moments of choice, and that respect was the foundation of every meaningful relationship. For the first time since waking in the chief's sacred tent, he felt a profound sense of belonging, a realization that he was part of something larger than himself, even if only temporarily. As sleep finally claimed him, John felt a quiet determination to continue learning, to honor the trust that had been placed in him, and to carry the lessons of the village with him for the rest of his life. He was no longer just a rancher. He was a student of life, a participant in a community that had taught him lessons he would never forget, and a man who had begun to understand the true meaning of courage, loyalty, and respect. The morning sun rose gently over the village, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. John Miller awoke with a quiet awareness that today might be different from the days before. The events of the past weeks had changed him deeply. He was no longer the man who had stumbled into the chief's sacred tent, confused and frightened. He had learned the rhythms of the village, the ways of its people, and the lessons taught patiently by the three women who had first observed him with careful eyes. Yet, despite the sense of belonging he felt, he knew that a choice awaited him, whether to remain in this world that had become so familiar or return to the life he had left behind. The camp was already alive with activity. Children ran along the paths between tents, laughing and calling to one another. The women moved with grace and purpose, tending fires, preparing meals, and teaching younger villagers the skills and knowledge that had been passed down for generations. John noticed the subtle interactions among them, a nod, a glance, a shared word, all conveying a depth of understanding that he had once thought impossible to grasp. The chief, calm and steady as ever, walked among the villagers, observing with quiet authority, ensuring that everything was in order. John spent the morning performing his usual tasks, carrying water from the creek, helping with cooking, and assisting in small repairs around the tents. Though these were simple actions, they held meaning, reflecting the value of service and respect within the community. The three women guided him as they always had. Jana demonstrated a new way to balance water containers while walking along uneven ground. Nayeli showed him a technique for weaving that made mats stronger and more durable. The third woman remained a calm presence, observing John's progress, her approval subtle but unmistakable. By midday, the chief gestured for John to follow him. Curiosity and anticipation filled him as he approached. The chief led him to a quiet spot near the edge of the village, where the trees opened to reveal a sweeping view of the valley beyond. Here, the chief paused, his gaze steady and thoughtful. Through gestures and expressions, he conveyed a message of respect and recognition. John understood that the chief was offering him a choice. He could stay in the village, living among people who had come to trust and accept him, or he could return to his life beyond the forest. John's mind raced as he considered the decision. Staying in the village meant a life of learning, connection, and participation in a world that had taught him so much. Returning to his ranch meant the comfort of familiarity, the life he had always known, and the responsibilities he had left behind. Yet the village had changed him. The lessons of patience, respect, courage, and humility had become part of who he was. He realized that whatever choice he made, he would carry these lessons with him for the rest of his life. As he stood in contemplation, the three women approached. Their expressions were calm and reassuring. Jana touched his arm gently, a silent encouragement to follow his heart. Nayeli nodded, conveying trust in whatever decision he would make. The third woman remained quiet but attentive, her steady gaze a reminder that his actions mattered not only to himself, but to those who had guided him. John felt a deep gratitude toward them. They had taught him more than skills. They had taught him understanding, empathy, and the power of human connection. After a long moment of reflection, John made his choice. He would return to his ranch, but not as the man who had once been captured and disoriented. He would return as someone transformed, carrying with him the wisdom, respect, and lessons learned in the village. He conveyed his decision through gestures and expressions, and the chief responded with a slow nod of approval. Though John would leave the physical space of the village, he understood that the bond he had formed and the lessons he had learned were enduring. Preparation for his departure began gently. The villagers, including the three women, helped him gather his belongings. They offered him small tokens of guidance and remembrance, a woven mat from Nayeli, a carefully crafted tool from Ayana, and the quiet blessing of the third woman. Each gift carried meaning, a tangible reminder of the wisdom and trust he had been given. John felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude. Leaving this world behind was difficult, yet he was filled with a sense of readiness and purpose for the life that awaited him. As he mounted his horse, Whisper, the villagers gathered to see him off. Children waved, the women gave final nods and gestures of encouragement, and the chief's gaze met his one last time, filled with respect and understanding. John understood that this farewell was not an ending, but a continuation of the connection he had forged, a bridge between two worlds, each richer for the experience. The journey back through the forest was quiet, giving John time to reflect on everything he had learned. He thought about the patience required to gain trust, the courage needed to face uncertainty, and the humility necessary to truly understand another way of life. Every lesson he had learned in the village had prepared him for challenges beyond its borders, and he felt a new sense of confidence and clarity. He realized that life was not simply about survival or routine. It was about connection, understanding, and the choices one made in moments of uncertainty. Along the trail, John noticed subtle changes in himself. He moved with more awareness, observing the natural signs of the land with a practiced eye. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, tempered by the humility and respect he had learned from the village. Even the simple act of riding whisper through the forest felt different, more deliberate, more mindful. Every sound, every movement, seemed part of a larger world he now understood in a deeper way. When he finally reached the edge of his ranch, the familiar sight of fences, cattle, and open fields greeted him. Yet, everything seemed slightly altered, not the land itself, but his perception of it. The ranch was the same, but John had changed. The lessons of the village, the guidance of the three women, and the trust of the chief had left an indelible mark on his character and his understanding of life. John set about resuming his work with renewed purpose. He tended the cattle, repaired fences, and maintained the routines of ranch life. But now he approached everything with the lessons he had learned. Patience, observation, respect for the land, and awareness of the connections between people and nature became part of his daily actions. He found that the skills he had acquired in the village were applicable in ways he had never imagined. Whether tracking a lost animal, preparing a balanced meal, or interacting with neighbors and friends. At night, John would sometimes sit by the fire, reflecting on his experiences. He thought about the three women who had guided him, the chief who had tested his courage and character, and the villagers who had accepted him. He realized that the time he spent in the village had been a rare opportunity, a moment in life that had challenged him, shaped him, and left him profoundly changed. The lessons he had learned were not just skills, but insights into humanity, trust, and the importance of community. In the quiet moments of reflection, John also considered the future. He understood that life was full of uncertainty and challenge, but he now faced it with a perspective that was richer, deeper, and more compassionate. He would carry the wisdom of the village with him, not as a set of rules, but as principles to guide his decisions, actions, and interactions. He knew that the impact of those lessons would extend far beyond his ranch, touching the way he lived, worked, and related to others. Though he had returned to his familiar surroundings, John never forgot the experience of waking in the chief's sacred tent and being observed by the three women. It had been the beginning of a journey, one that had tested his courage, patience, and respect. It had shown him a world beyond his own, a world rich with tradition, knowledge, and human connection. And it had taught him that true understanding required not just observation, but active participation, humility, and the willingness to learn from those who were different from oneself. As the sun set over his ranch, John looked out across the fields, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. He had faced fear, embraced learning, and gained trust. He had experienced a life far different from his own, and emerged with a deeper understanding of people, culture, and the values that unite communities. The lessons of the village, embodied in the guidance of the three women, would remain with him forever, shaping not only his actions but the way he saw the world. In the stillness of the evening, John smiled quietly to himself. Though he had left the village behind, he carried it within him, its wisdom, its traditions, and the bonds he had formed. He understood that true life experiences are measured not by ease or comfort, but by the lessons learned, the connections made, and the growth achieved through patience, respect, and courage. He had returned to his ranch, but he had been transformed. And in that transformation, he found a sense of purpose, understanding, and peace that would guide him for the rest of his life. John knew that life would continue with its challenges and uncertainties, but he was ready. He had faced fear, earned trust, and embraced a world far larger than his own. And as he settled by his fire that night, he carried with him a quiet confidence, a knowledge that he had been tested, had grown, and had emerged wiser, stronger, and deeply changed by the lessons of a people who had welcomed him, guided him, and taught him the true meaning of respect, courage, and community.